everybody who's presently logged in, and others will log in, I'm sure, as the talk progresses. Basically, the reason I want to just explain the situation to you is that today Mandy has opened this talk up to non-SKT members. SKT, by the way, is Senior Cooler Talk, which is our group of Stephanians alumni which meets up on a regular basis. And we started these talks about 3 years ago. But just to explain the situation, we have like today we have four major speakers, and then Mandy will be introducing them, and Mandy will sort of get each one started, and then after that we'll open it up to general discussion from everybody. That's the whole idea, and basically these talks are hosted by I.L.A. Pasrich, who we thank very much, and who's been doing it now for 3 years, as I said, and also to the St. Stephen's Alumni Association, which the principal has put us on to, and that has not only the listing of the talks but also has people join in both connecting here and on the YouTube channel or the YouTube link, which is also available. Today's talk comprises basically of a concept which is not that easy for all of us to understand, but we want to look at it because we want a discussion on it. It's called the end game. Basically talking at India and Pakistan at 75 years, but are we saying that is there an end game to this India-Pakistan situation? Now, to answer that, some people will argue that there's not even an end game. There's no need for an end game. But anyway, let's hear that from the experts. We have Raghavan Saab, who is the former High Commissioner to Pakistan, and we have Ajay Bisaria, who's also a former High Commissioner, the two from the Foreign Service. We have Sanjay Kathuria, who was with the World Bank for many years, and he talks about the whole economic situation. And we have Tilak Deveshar, who's now a member of the National Security Advisory Board. So we have four real luminaries here, all Stephanians, and the talk is on that. Mandy will now introduce everybody. Mandy, we all know very well. Mandy is a real stud, but more than that, Mandy is basically the pun master of the group, and you'll hear him say all kinds of things and put all kinds of things on the web about it. But basically, Mandy started one of the oldest, it's called IBEX Expeditions, one of the oldest travel expedition companies in India, and he's been running it for many years. He's also the founder president of the Responsible Tourism Society, which does a lot of good work, and hopefully we'll talk about that someday. He has talked about it already in one of the earlier talks. So with that, I'll request Mandy to kindly take over, introduce the speakers, and let's get the show on the road. Thanks, Mandy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pitu, and welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you, and let's get on with our very exciting topic. So we've got four speakers. We'll be requesting each one of them to take a 10-minute slot and give us a capsule on, what they feel about this very interesting story of the India-Pakistan relationship. Let me first request TC Raghavan, who did his BSc in physics in '76 from college, and later did a MA and a MPhil in history from JNU, and he earned his PhD there too. He retired from the Foreign Service as India's High Commissioner to Pakistan in 2015, and he also served there earlier in 2007, and he's been with our embassies in Singapore, Kuwait, Bhutan, and UK. And whilst he was at the External Affairs, he was also in the office of the External Affairs Minister with Mr. Jaswant Singh. And he's been Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, and he sits on the Governing Council of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi. Of course, he writes many books, and he's done lots of lectures and panel discussions and all, and we've heard him in the past, and it's very arresting. So with that, TCA, I believe legend says that given your name, that you're not just Raghavan, but you're the one and only one that can hold forth on the India-Pakistan relations with some aplomb. And your last book seems to be called The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan. So over to you, because I think we are a very curious set of audience here, wanting to know a little more about this wonderfully curious relationship that we fielded for 75 years. So over to you, Raghavan.
Thank you very much, Mandy, for that introduction. And thank you, Pitu, for inviting me to join Ajay and Tilak and Sanjay for this discussion on Pakistan. Since I have only 10 minutes, let me start off by looking at the situation we are in today and have been for the last 5 or 6 years. It is possibly one of the bad periods, or one of the worst periods of India-Pakistan relations, given the fact that we have a downgrading of diplomatic links, a virtual closure of trade and any kind of political, diplomatic, or people-to-people contact. There's generally a high level of pretty toxic rhetoric, usually on both sides. Until about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, this situation was also regularly punctuated by serious clashes on the line of control and some very robust anti-terrorism measures which the government of India took. So it is a pretty bad situation by any standards, although by India-Pakistan standards, it is not exceptional. We have had as many as 4 major conflicts in 1948, in 1965, in 1971, and the Kargil conflict. So at least 4 major conflicts. If you include the Kutch action of 1965, it's possibly 5 conflicts, plus other numerous instances of pretty serious military situations. So the present situation, while bad, is not something unusual given the past 75 years of India-Pakistan history. I should say that the present situation is also, at least in optical terms, is characterized very strongly by a lock-in to 2 widely divergent positions. The Indian view is and has consistently been for some time that talks and terror cannot go together. For Pakistan, on the other hand, the question is that unless there is a resolution of the Kashmir quote-unquote dispute, things will not progress in any meaningful sense in developing a positive interface between the 2 countries. So you're locked into these 2 respective mutually antagonistic positions. Now, the terrorism factor, of course, looms very large in our consciousness because from the 80s, it has been a very dominant factor in our public life. And that is something which we all understand, and certainly people of our generation will recall that period of the 1980s, of the 1990s, and thereafter in the first decade of this century and later. But it's useful to recall that a bad India-Pakistan relationship, in fact, predates the terrorism phase in the India-Pakistan interface. We had, as I said, serious conflicts in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and also periods of near conflict in the 1980s. So it is not simply that because terrorism is such a major factor that India-Pakistan relations have taken this very negative course. There are more fundamental structural issues that have bedeviled India-Pakistan relations almost from 1947. And in that sense, the fact that we are at 75 years since that since the time when we both emerged as sovereign entities. It's a useful time to take stock of what is happening. Now, I wish to make two or three general points because there's a great deal which can be said about uh, India-Pakistan relations. But clearly, the historical aspect weighs very heavily on every aspect of India-Pakistan relations. In many ways, if you look at look at the nature of the interface between India and Pakistan in the 1950s and 1960s, it is very reminiscent of the kind of absence of any meaningful forward steps in the dialogues which took place between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League in the 1940s. So clearly, the historical legacy which exists in the relationship is pretty significant, and we can't ignore that. But it is also true that notwithstanding these all the negatives which I have mentioned in India-Pakistan relations and the negative phase we are going through, what has also been a constant feature of India-Pakistan relations have been the efforts made to try to restore things or establish things on a more positive footing. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, notwithstanding all the other negatives, you also had very, very well thought out and concerted moves to try to give the relationship a more positive, uh, exterior or a more positive content. I recall when I first went to Pakistan in February 2003. At that time, also India and Pakistan were going through a very, very serious phase and a very bad phase of their bilateral relationship. This was a few months after our parliament had been attacked by terrorist groups, and it was very clear that that this action had something to do with Pakistan state agencies. And when I reached Islamabad in February 2003, the general impression was that things are so bad that possibly the mission will have to close down and there will be a further serious deterioration in the political relationship, possibly ending in some kind of military action. But in fact, that did not happen because by April, Prime Minister Vajpayee had made substantial overtures. And in fact, by January of the following year, he was in Islamabad. And then from 2004 to 2008, you had a very, very positive phase to India-Pakistan relations. Similarly, if you look at our current phase, in 2014, when the current government was elected to power for the first time, the general expectation was that India-Pakistan relations will inevitably go south. But in fact, things began on a very positive note. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was invited for Prime Minister Modi's swearing in. And in end 2015, Prime Minister Modi himself visited Lahore in a gesture which suggested that he was prepared to put his personal political capital behind the India-Pakistan positive process. And certainly, to a very great extent, all of this happened because all his gestures were being reciprocated by the then Pakistan Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. As you know, things didn't work out in the way which was expected, and from 2016, things went south, and the position has continued. Position deteriorated substantially in 2017, 2018. But the general point is that notwithstanding this very adversarial relationship which exists with all its negative connotations, there have always been efforts made to give it a more positive orientation. So I think that trend will continue, that you will have a generally adversarial relationship, but from time to time, efforts will be made to restore it and to put it on a more positive foundation. So in that sense, when one talks about the end game, I think there is really going to be there's not going to be an end game, but you're going to see a repetition of this cyclical pattern of ups and downs in India-Pakistan relations. Now, the final point I wish to make, and I want to end on this note, that this does suggest that there is something exceptional about India-Pakistan relations. That the most which we can hope for is a management of the relationship so that it does not deteriorate.
Sorry, we just lost you, Raghavan, for a last minute. Raghavan?
I think I was muted. Now I'm fine.
Sorry, I think there was some glitch. Can you just say the last point again from there, please?
So the point I was making was that it may appear that the India-Pakistan relations, because of its overwhelming negative features, is somehow exceptional. And what I would like to do is contest that view and say, yes, India-Pakistan relations have very, very negative features, but the fact that they are, full of this mixture of negatives and occasional positives is not something which should surprise us. All neighborhood relations are very difficult in South Asia, but if you look around the world, you'll find many examples of neighboring countries having similar difficulties in managing neighborhood issues. If you look in our own neighborhood, occasionally, not only occasionally, but frequently, you have had situations with Sri Lanka or Nepal or even with Bangladesh, where things have appeared to be pretty bad, but then efforts have been made to restore older, more stable balance. And in my assessment, this is the pattern which is going to repeat itself with Pakistan too, that because of this historical legacy and the burden of numerous structural factors to which there is no clear solution now and possibly is never likely to be one, such as Kashmir, we will have a relationship which is adversarial in content. But from time to time, efforts will be made to restore that relationship to a more positive level. And possibly we are now at a phase which is now going to turn and we will see some positive efforts emanating. When that will happen is difficult to say, but that something like that will happen is almost certain. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Raghavan. That was a great insight, and I'm sure we'll all hold our questions till the end. But let me now quickly get in Sanjay Kathuria, who will give us a slightly different perspective from the economic point of view. Sanjay graduated from college in 1978. I think can I just request everyone to be on mute, please, whoever is not speaking? Thank you. And he was in college in 78, finishing his master's, his BA degree in economics, and he went on to do his master's at the D School of Economics. Later, he got an INLAC scholarship and did his PhD from Oxford, and he is now a proper Professor Sahib, the senior visiting fellow and for the Center for Policy Research, and a senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore. He's also a professor at the Georgetown University and Ashoka University and so on. And he's also been a lead economist with the World Bank. Having written over 6 books on trade, investments, etc. on South Asia, he's also writing one more, which gives a pretty good insight into how important it is to have a good trade relationship, especially between India and Pakistan. And I guess little known about Sanjay was that he was also a great table tennis player, and he represented, I think he played at the Nationals. So I guess he'd be very adept at understanding some ping pong diplomacy here, looking at it from the lens of the economies and the trade. So, Sanjay, over to you. Smash it for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mandeep. And thanks for this event and allowing me to speak in the presence of distinguished colleagues and friends. So we all know how fragile people's budgets are in South Asia, right? And how susceptible they are to inflation. Pakistan inflation in August 2022, the latest figure, was over 27%. And food inflation was 30%, and transport was 63%. Okay, so fact number one. Secondly, dollar has appreciated about 42% vis-a-vis the Pakistani rupee over the last year. And this is reflected in the consumer prices I just talked about. It's reflected in debt repayments. Fact number three, gross financing requirements for Pakistan over the next 3 years. That means external finance, all that they need in terms of commitments, all that they need to finance in order to be sustainable over the next 3 years is over $100 billion, which is about 26% of GDP. Reserves are precarious and they're down to about 6 weeks of imports. And on this, another point on this is which I'm sure is a question which many will raise. So I'm preempting it by talking about China debt. So the China debt, the total debt, bilateral official is about 23 billion and commercial is almost 7 billion. So it's about 30% of all public external debt comes from China. But domestic debt is much larger than external debt. And this is what makes Pakistan less vulnerable, for example, compared to Sri Lanka, who has gone into debt default, as we know. So in the face of all these short-term problems, there has been much belt tightening, despite floods, despite inflation, record climate catastrophe. But because of this precarious economic situation even before COVID, before the Russian invasion and all of that, this is to bring, so they've gone to the IMF to bring things in order, and they got very recently, the IMF program was restarted. So Pakistan has used the IMF, and that's an indicator of how of crises, that they've gone to the IMF more often than probably any other country in the world. Okay, so 23 visits to the IMF, and and I'm not very optimistic that they won't go yet again. Okay, so that was just putting some short-term issues so that I can talk about the longer-term issues. So the longer-term issues, in some sense, for an economist, they're much more important, right? And is why Pakistan goes through repeated crises. 23, as exemplified in 23 visits to the IMF. A very important fact is crony capitalism, which results in very strong, what we call rent-seeking behavior. And distinguished economists of Pakistan have estimated that could cost from about half to almost 2% of GDP, right? And Mehboob al-Haq had famously talked about this in the 80s, about 22 families in Pakistan basically controlling the economy. And it hasn't changed dramatically since then in terms of the substance of things. The lack of persistent democracy is also an economic problem, and the role of the army. This is a major economic issue, and the presence of extremism. All of this leads to instability for an economic outlook. And business, those of our friends who in business will know that they hate uncertainty more than anything else. Since you have constant volatility in democracy, in the politics, this also creates, negates much of the animal spirits of entrepreneurs. So what is the outcome of these factors? One is that there is very high protection, external protection, because of the crony capitalists. And Pakistan has repeated external crises that I talked about. A lot of it thanks to protection and trade, where it is not externally, it's not an export-oriented economy, and it hit its peak in trade as early as 1993, which is very different from the rest of the world and the rest of South Asia. The army preempts resources, currently 4% of GDP, which is a very significant, which is 1/3 of its total tax and other intake of the government. Tax collection, again, thanks to, because the business is very strong, the tax collection is much lower than peers and results in large fiscal deficits. And there is a lack of a relationship with its neighbors, especially India. And I'll speak a little bit more about that. And one thing which is very critical as a marker is Bangladesh. There is a lot of comparisons, interesting comparisons that can be made. Bangladesh's GDP, just in nominal dollar terms, overtook Pakistan in 2019, and its exports crossed Pakistan 5 years before that, in 2014. And I don't see any actions that currently, or any indications of actions on the part of current or past governments that are addressing these ubiquitous and long-term constraints. So finally, I will say a little bit on how the lack of economic relations with India and more broadly in South Asia hurts Pakistan and the rest of South Asia. Well, we did a study in 2015, one of those that Mandeep referred to, that the Pakistan had normal relations with India, perhaps would not even have seen these repeated crises that we are seeing. It would have seen a minimal of 80% increase in its global exports, not just exports with India, had it had normal relations with India, right? So it's very significant kicker to its overall global exports. Even before 2019, that is pre all the the virtual banning of trade between the two sides, trade was only 11% of potential between Pakistan and India. So we are under exploiting almost 90%, even in a normal, so-called normal situation in pre-2019. Now this hurts Pakistan a great deal, right? It is a smaller economy. So not having relations with a giant neighbor really hurts that. It hurts consumers. We know how people are suffering from inflation, and a significant part of that, especially in agricultural products, could have been alleviated had it been trading with India. So consumers, exporters who don't get cheap inputs, seasonal agriculture exchange, power trade. There was a lot of talk when I was in the World Bank of starting power trade between India and Pakistan, and we were very close to doing that. But then, again, politics intervened, and then there could be so much else, like transit facilities between the two countries, and there would be dynamic pressures to perform. There could be supply chains between the two Punjabs. And, we are only limited by imagination in terms of what could happen between the two countries. And there could be a 2 percentage point increase in GDP of Pakistan. This is, many studies have estimated. Mind you, it doesn't leave India unscathed. India hurts strongly. Conservatively, Pakistan could form 7% of India's exports, very conservatively, instead of 0.5%. I mean, I'm talking pre-2019. And there could be transit to Central Asia, energy trade, the famous Tapi pipeline, the gas pipeline, and all of this hurts South Asia as a whole. Because the region does not coalesce, and it is a natural region that can do so much together, not least for combating climate change, we are seeing the evidence of that. This year we saw it in the heat waves, now we're seeing it in the floods, not just in Pakistan, but in India and Bangladesh too. So the region underperforms hugely because this relationship, India-Pakistan, does not work. So my hope is that at some point the trade interests will become so glaring and so obvious that will begin to override others and in time create openings for other agreements in other areas. Look at India, China, despite all the problems, it's the largest trading relationship for India, right? So there are things, there are examples that we ourselves in India do. So meantime, we continue to fight the good fight and we continue to plug away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanjay. That's a great insight from the economic lens, and I'm sure some of that was quite a revelation to many of us. Let me now get in our third speaker, which is in the form of Ajay Bisaria, who finished his eco in college in 1983, and then quite unusually went on to do an MBA from IIM Cal, and then he did a master's degree later from Princeton. What people may not know about him, that he has a fairly deep voice, which allowed him to become a radio jockey during his early days. And Ajay has had a very distinguished career over 35 years, dealing with some of the key economic and security relationships for the country. And he was also the High Commissioner very recently, until very recently, to Canada, where he just retired in June 22. And I can vouch that he plays a half-decent game of golf as well. He's also served as the High Commissioner of India to Pakistan earlier in 2017 and 20, and has been to Poland and Lithuania, and he's put in time at our embassies with Berlin and Moscow. Incidentally, Ajay has also served with the Prime Minister's office during Mr. Vajpayee's time, from 99 to 2004. And I know that as a personal believer in track 2 diplomatic processes, I was very keen to hear Ajay at least touch upon the role of the track 2. And Kuldeep, if you can put up that one little image, because Ajay, I wanted to tell you that this year marks the 20 years of a very unique track 2 experiment, which was carried out in the Swiss Alps with the Indo-Pakistan Friendship Expedition. And this was the first time that the flags flew in friendship. And the idea was that we focus on the environmental impact that the two armies are having on the Siachen Glacier and declare it as a zone of peace. But such like and many more serious events have of course taken place, and you are yourself very aware. So what sort of a role does that play, and what has indeed been your experience of our relationship with Pakistan? And are you much in agreement with what Raghavan had to observe earlier, that maybe there is no end game, though we'd love to believe something more constructive or more positive? So over to you, Ajay. The stage is yours for 10 minutes.
Thanks.
Sorry,
Thanks,
Kuldeep, if you can remove that picture now. Thank you. Over to you, Ajay.
Andy, thanks very much. So let me start right away, and perhaps I should take off from where Raghavan stopped and talk about a little bit of the internal context in Pakistan, because that's really very important in determining the shape of our relationship, and then get on to your question about track 2. So I was in Pakistan in 2017, which was a couple of years after Raghavan left. And as I walked the Wagah border, across to the Wagah border, I felt the hand of history on my shoulder. As Raghavan said, I was very aware that this is a very cyclical relationship, and I was entering this on a low point of the cycle. So I was there 2017 to 2019 in Pakistan, and I left somewhat abruptly. I was expelled after India's decisions on Article 370. And, it ended somewhat suddenly. But the point is that through my tenure, I did not have a sense of gloom all the time. So within even a low point of the cycle, there are microcycles, and there are cycles, and there are glimmers of hope. And in fact, when I looked back at my tenure in microcosm, there was a lot that happened which has happened earlier in normal times. We went through 2 election cycles, but of course we had Pulwama and we had the Balakot airstrikes, and we had also Article 370. But I think starting talking a little bit more of contemporary times, if you look at the current Pakistan, we had a sense of fear of seeing a perfect storm and seeing a sort of situation on the ground that matched what happened in Sri Lanka. With this economic catastrophe, which Sanjay described, the fractious politics that has been unfolding, the weakening of the army, and of course, the very unprecedented monsoon floods. So all these made for a perfect storm, but the sense was that Pakistan, as before, would muddle through, as it has done through 23 IMF visits. But the couple of points I wanted to make about Pakistan's internal politics, and if you look at the 15 years of guided democracy that Pakistan has had, what we are seeing right now is, in essence, 4 major political parties. So the army has itself to blame for this situation reaching this pass, because it has acted like a political party. And today, when you see Pakistani media and there's a Game of Thrones speculation on who will be the next prime minister, what will happen, there is also a Game of Thrones speculation about who would be the next army chief and what would happen within the army. So the army has got itself very involved in the politics and very politicized. Of course, it continues to hold all levers of power. So it continues to control foreign and security policy, which is within its domain. We also have a scenario when we talk of a likely scenario of 2 major events coming up. One, which would be the selection of the next army chief, or the continuation of the current incumbent. And then, of course, an election that is likely in perhaps next year. And the question or the implication for the bilateral relationship is that with that election coming up, with this fractious politics, the space for bilateral diplomacy or creative diplomacy on the Pakistan side has certainly gone down. So I think if you look at the current bilateral situation, as Raghavan said, it is a bit of a stalemate because with India's policy of 2016 of no talks with terror, you now suddenly have a Pakistan policy which Imran Khan has imposed on the rest of the polity, which is no talks with Article 370. So that itself, that has served to reduce the space that Pakistan has. And very recently, for instance, Pakistan squandered an opportunity for disaster diplomacy. There was a broad enough hint from India when the Prime Minister condoled the loss of life there that India could have helped, but Pakistan did not make the request and did not make use of that opportunity. We also have another opportunity coming up this weekend of an SCO summit, where a great deal of geopolitics is going to come together, because you will have, apart from India and Pakistan, Russia, China in the same room in Samarkand. And there the question again would be, would there be an opportunity for at least saying hello, or at least making some move? Uzbekistan or Tashkent, you would remember, has a certain resonance in the relationship historically. In 1966, after the 65 conflict, that's where the peace agreement had been signed. And so, you know, it raises a larger issue of plurilateral diplomacy becoming a means for helping bilateral diplomacy, whether it's the SARC or the SCO. So it's somewhat like, you know, you have an estranged cousin, you don't want to meet him one-on-one, but at a family wedding, you might just go and say hello, and that might just break the ice. So there is this potential for a conversation, or at least a very informal conversation this weekend. But coming back in that context to track two, I certainly think it does serve a purpose. It would generate ideas and out-of-the-box ideas which can inform track one and the policymakers and the negotiators, particularly when track one conversations are limited and you're not having structured conversations. So as policymakers or former policymakers, we know that we all keep looking for good ideas, which often come from track two. The second issue is that with track two, you can engage newer constituencies in both countries. You can, be talking of youth, professionals, traders, bloggers, influencers, newer constituencies which would be able to divorce themselves from the traditional rhetoric and the traditional politics of the relationship. Also, I think, track two, it is important for them to socialize these ideas with track one, but also in general public constituencies. For instance, when I was in Pakistan, I was looking for some ideas for a possible breakthrough. And I tried to find what the 18 or 20 track twos have recommended over a period of time. And we had some trouble collating this because not all of it tends to come into either the public domain or to be shared with government. And I think that is important for to folks to remember, that they need to be briefing the governments, or at least socializing some of the ideas so that they could get more traction. And the other problem often with track two is that sometimes the track one talking points enter into track two, and you don't really get many out-of-the-box solutions. So it's important for people to be ahead of the curve and not just be repeating the kind of conversations the countries had at the government level. Also, I think Sanjay, for instance, alluded to trade. And there's been a recent book by Sharad Sabharwal where he talks about trade as a possible means, taking the China example, taking the Bangladesh example for starting a process of normalization. And I think that is an important part, but it's important also to remember that in trade, for Pakistan, the discourse often internally is of prosperity, survival, using this large neighbor to be able to do business, to be able to increase prosperity and growth. But for India, it has largely been a confidence building measure. It's not a major country for India to do trade with, but a confidence building measure, certainly in the context of the larger relationship, whether it's trade across the LOC or trade in general. And I think in the track context, the point is that we should be engaging trade constituencies. Business and trade constituencies should also be engaging with each other to create those equities in the relationship for when the possible up cycle or the positive part of the cycle begins, that we could populate it with ideas. So I think overall the people to people relationship, the peace constituencies are important. They serve a purpose. When the relationship is low, they appear not to matter at all, but they do have a certain traction and they can influence things in the longer term. So let me stop right there. Thank you, Mandy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ajay. That was a great insight on both track two and the regular stuff going on and the importance. And again, I think we'll park some of the questions which Pitu very soon will field after we've had our last speaker of the day in the form of Tilak Devesha. Tilak, as many would remember, finished from Mayo College in 70, and he finished his master's in college in 76 in history. He retired as a special secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat and is now a member of the National Security Advisory Board and a distinguished fellow at the United Services Institution of India. He specializes in security issues, of course, and especially with regards to the neighborhood, which includes Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's the author of 3 very widely acclaimed books on Pakistan. One of them is Courting the Abyss, which was termed by a Pakistani commentator as easily the best book on Pakistan. And if that was not enough, he wrote another one called Pakistan at the Helm, and Pakistan, the Balochistan Conundrum. And a Pakistani reviewer in the Dawn said that far better books than the books, it is a far better book than the books that have been written on the subject by our own academics and writers. So that's high praise indeed. And his fourth book is called The Pashtuns, A Contested History. And I'm told it will be available in the books, in the bookshops pretty shortly. And what people may not know, or many of you will know, that he is the younger brother of our own Vijay Deveshar, who sadly passed away many years ago. And I do remember him with some fond memories because he was my school teacher before he joined the IAS, and a great mountaineer. So with that, Tilak, can we ask you to give us a real situation on the ground, as much as you can reveal, on the security scenario with India and Pakistan? And do you really also believe that the end game is like one of our friends from the MEA said, it is a long suffer? Now, whether that suffer is a journey or is a suffer as in suffering, we don't know. But over to you, and give us some input. Thank you. You're on mute. One moment. Kuldeep, can we get him on unmute, please? Kuldeep?
Yes, sir.
Please unmute Mr. Tilak Deveshar.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mandy, for that introduction. Given what's happening in Pakistan, even as we speak, almost a third of the country inundated and devastated by floods, and a country deeply politically polarized, I think it'd be useful to begin by taking a brief look at Pakistan in 75 before talking about India-Pakistan in 75. The reason I say this is because 75 years after its creation, Pakistanis themselves are asking fundamental questions. Like, is it really a cause for celebration for a nuclear country of 220 million to rejoice at the mere approval of an IMF loan to keep the economy afloat? They're also asking whether the mere survival of the country is a success story in itself, or will it be a success story only when the country begins to thrive and prosper? Now, it's not that Pakistan does not have strengths or achievements. To name a few, a strategic geographical location and agricultural rich land with the largest contiguous irrigation system in the world, a hard-working and resilient people, and so on. But despite this, seen in totality, the current situation of political drift, with even the army supposedly on the back foot, acute political polarization and growing Islamic radicalization, would show a country whose problems are significant and could challenge its capacities and capabilities to tackle them. Coming to the subject at hand, there have been a couple of positives on the bilateral front, which we need to acknowledge. India and Pakistan have cooperated in allowing the transit of Indian wheat to Afghanistan. And Pakistan so far has not opposed India's engagement with the Taliban. Both countries also handled the accidental firing of an Indian missile with a lot of maturity and restraint. The key positive has been the reinstitution of the ceasefire on the LOC in February 2021. There was media speculation that back-channel diplomacy, something that Ajay talked to, led to the ceasefire. This, however, did not translate into a process, despite Pakistan's assertions during the March 21 Islamabad Security Dialogue that was held to showcase Pakistan's desire to change the narrative from quote-unquote geopolitical contestation to geo-economic integration. The key takeaway on Indo-Pak relations was General Bajwa, the army chief, saying that Pakistan was keen to bury the past and move forward. The expectations raised were crushed, however, when Imran Khan as Prime Minister shut down what Imran Khan as Commerce Minister had approved, the import of sugar and cotton from India. He stated that there could be no trade with India unless the 5th August 2019 changes pertaining to J&K were reversed. There was a lot of perplexity in India as to why this was done, because for a change it appeared that the army was on board to normalize relations. Given the scale of internal problems inherited by the Shehbaz Sharif government and now compounded by floods, it is highly unlikely that Pakistan would expend any political capital on Indo-Pak relations. So, pending any fresh articulation or signaling from Pakistan, it is presumed that its position remains the same as under Imran Khan. There is no dialogue till the changes of 5th August 2019 are reversed. The major political event that I think will favorably impact bilateral relations is the exit of Imran Khan from the helm in Pakistan. Imran Khan had injected into the bilateral discourse such personal animosity and rancor against Prime Minister Modi that was not only surprising for a head of government, but made resumption of a dialogue at the political level impossible. His efforts to praise Indian diplomacy in his post-exit speeches have been noted, is seen as a desperate attempt to claw back some goodwill in India, but nobody is buying this. On the negative side, since August 2019, there has been evidence of Pakistani drones dropping arms, ammunition, IED, and drugs in Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. This is a clear indicator that the ISI and the Khalistani terrorists in Pakistan are attempting to revive the insurgency in Punjab using narco-terrorism in a big way. There has also been a spurt of Khalistani propaganda activities abroad. Second, analysts and think tanks in India are looking closely at the unfolding political churning in Pakistan. Imran Khan has been triumphant in Punjab, though it remains to be seen if his threat to launch a fresh street agitation to force early elections would be translated into action. He continues to draw huge crowds everywhere. Under these circumstances, I don't think anyone in India would be willing to invest in Indo-Pak relations till the picture clarifies. For one thing, if elections are held and Imran Khan loses, he is unlikely to accept the results and will restart street confrontation. If he wins, it will be back to square one. On the economy, I would just like to mention something about the reopening of trade that many believe could be the low-hanging fruit to kickstart a dialogue. Several hints have been given by the Pak leadership, including the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, about trade with India. For example, Finance Minister Miftah Ismail was on record that he personally supported the idea to allow import of vegetables from India, and the international organization that approached Pakistan to import food items from India as part of relief operations. However, the minister said that the decision in this regard will be taken after consultation with coalition partners. The moot question for India is whether through such signaling about trade, is Islamabad interested in normalizing relations? And if so, whether it can be trusted on political and security engagement. Under the governments of Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Shri Manmohan Singh, the focus on economic initiatives was to develop a strategy of economic interdependence. Under the current government, after 2 unsuccessful attempts, I think it has been realized, the diplomatic futility of reaching out to Islamabad has probably been realized. India is just looking beyond Pakistan by investing in global and Indo-Pacific partnerships. A word about flood relief from India. I think India is ready to provide aid to Pakistan today, but the latter needs to be open to receiving it. You would recall that during the 2005 earthquake, India had provided 1,300 tons of relief material from cash and other assistance. India had deployed 1 aircraft and 2 trains to mobilize this relief. 5 transit points were also opened for movement of material. If Pakistan is not open to bilaterally accepting assistance from India today, there is also a precedent for mobilizing aid through international institutions. During 2010 and 2011 floods, Pakistan accepted India's offer of assistance that was routed through the World Food Programme. Overall, in an ideal world, Pakistani leaders would reassess reality and look at India and Afghanistan as trading partners as its own national security policy claims, prioritizing geoeconomics instead of geopolitics. However, under the present circumstances, I don't see this happening. Coupled with the political and economic turmoil in Pakistan, India is therefore, in my view, likely to adopt a cautious wait-and-see approach before investing any capital in a bilateral relationship. The focus will be on management of relations rather than on normalization till there is clarity about what is happening in Pakistan. In other words, not letting relations deteriorate further. As it is, the relationship with Pakistan is unpredictable, and a single terror incident can change the discourse. An improvement in the optics and language of diplomatic exchanges should help. Indo-Pak relations are thus likely to be in limbo. A last word. There has been speculation if the two prime ministers could meet on the sidelines of the SCO meeting at Samarkand being held on the 15th and 16th of September. It would be interesting to see what actually happens. Thank you.
Very. Thanks, Tilak. That was very well injected with some tempering of what is going on in the situation as of today. But maybe now it's time for me to hand over to our very own Dr. Didar Singh, also popularly known as Pitu, who, for the ones who are from outside college, might know that he was the Secretary of the Overseas Indian Affairs, and he was also the Director General of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And he also taught in college, by the way, which I believe was prompted by the fact that he finished his MA history in 74 and the girls came in 75. So he decided to hang on a bit. So over to you, Pitu. You can sort of handle the question and answer, which I'm sure there will be many. Thanks.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks for the introduction, and I hope that you can all hear me. I have a couple of comments on the entire talk, and also a couple of questions. First of all, the comment. We are talking today about India at 75 and Pakistan at 75, and we're talking about the end game. So there are two different issues being talked about. One, we are talking about the fact where is India today and where is Pakistan today. I think the speakers have made that quite clear, and the world has also seen it. And my only comment on that matter is that the day India becomes to Pakistan what China has become to India, Pakistan will no more be an issue of any importance. Item number 2. So far as end game is concerned, I would say it doesn't matter if there's an end game or there's not an end game. The reality of diplomacy and the reality of the two countries will come out in a way that has to be handled by the mature politicians that we expect on both sides. Finally, I have a question really which is addressed to all of them. My first question is, this track to diplomacy that Ajay Bisaria talked about, is it leading to some back channel work? And is the back channel work working? Is it actually happening? Tilak also referred something to about this. Is back channel working, and do we expect something more to happen through the back channel? For example, and here is my real question to all of you. We've talked about SAARC. We know that SAARC has failed, and today as a security matter, SAARC is not happening. But can we talk of SAARC in a virtual state? Can we talk about SAARC happening virtually, so that all the prime ministers of all the SAARC countries can actually come on through a video conference and talk to each other? At least something to break the present scenario that we are in, so that what we had mentioned a little earlier in terms of the economic relationship that Sanjay so well put out, can that economic relationship actually begin to happen? I hope that some of you will be able to react to this and give us your views on this matter. Thank you very much. Any of them, Raghavan, Ajay, anyone?
Should I start?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, no, Ajay is quite right that black channels are important. And certainly in the India-Pakistan context, where there is so much public emotion and sentiment tied up with all the issues, you need often discussions which are totally divorced from public perceptions, so that views can be shared with candor and there is no excessive sentiment or cynicism attached to that meeting. So back channels are important. But back channels are important only up to a point, because a back channel cannot be an end to in itself. In the end, a back channel, if successful, has to lead to a front channel. And if that doesn't happen, it doesn't really change the situation very drastically. So I would say, yes, the back channel has had, if it led to the ceasefire, which has held, and it is a very positive development, it's good. But in the end, it has to lead to something else beyond that, because you cannot just expect that a relationship of the complexity of India and Pakistan can be handled on the side. You need a larger political process for it to become, have more stability, notwithstanding all the risks which Tilak mentioned. And I don't think anyone discounts the fact that you may be just one terrorist attack away from another major crisis. Those risks are there. But to my mind, the larger question of what you are going to do with a neighbor like Pakistan depends really on what view you have of yourself and of the world. Now, while we may say that, once we become like China, something like Pakistan will not be a relevant factor. Possibly that is true, but unless you have a neighborhood which is stable, it is going to be a major impediment on your growth all the time. I don't think we should kid ourselves about the great risks which exist if you are in a perpetually unstable situation. And one example of that is what is happening in Europe today. When you allow neighborhood relations to deteriorate without keeping them unchecked, as happened between Russia and Ukraine, there are certainly no winners. There may be those who lose more, but everyone loses and loses very substantially. If you want to avoid that kind of situation, do you need to take any steps now? That really is the question. It's not a question of whether you think relations between India and Pakistan will ever be normal. Or, as I suggested, I don't think they ever will be normal in the sense we understand normal. But what is in your interest? Do you wish to have a relationship with greater stability, or do you feel that it's not possible to have a relationship with greater stability and therefore let's throw in the towel? I think those really are the issues which we have to constantly think about, given our own circumstances in South Asia, given what is happening in the wider region with China and the US-China contestations, etc.
Thank you so much. Ajay or Tilak, would you like to add?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I may. Sorry.
Yeah, Ajay, go ahead.
Yeah. So if I may, Pitu, it's important not to conflate track 2 and back channel. I mean, under the rubric of creative diplomacy and diplomacy, apart from the one taking place country to country, we do have alternatives. One would be quiet diplomacy between the countries where the embassies are talking to each other, but not disclosing it in the public domain. Back channel is what we've already had a great deal of experience with. This would be an officially sanctioned but not publicly disclosed channel, as we did have in the early 2000s, that led to the breakthrough of the 2004 Islamabad summit. And later, Ambassador Sati Lamba was involved in a conversation which was going on between then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and General Musharraf. So there have been back channels. They've been instrumental in even having the ceasefire that we got last year. So those would be the officially sanctioned channels. What I think Mandy asked about and referred to was the track to people engagement. And that would be when Mandy meets with a Pakistani friend in Switzerland and in a group in an unstructured way, has a conversation, and then comes up with some great ideas and tries to feed it back to the governments and to policymakers. So that is what I would describe as track 2. And as to your question about virtual SAARC summits, I think what we have right now is a situation of a stalemate on any summit, any engagement, virtual or real. But as I said, the plurilateral format, SCO, SAARC, that gives you a sort of umbrella to have those conversations, perhaps even in third countries, when the bilateral relationship is in trouble. And again, to Raghavan's point, I would agree with that. That we cannot have a policy of which says let's ignore Pakistan. The power differential is too big. That's like saying I will ignore my toothache and I will focus only on my headache because the headache is more important. So you need to be engaging or have a policy to deal with a difficult neighbor, whether or not it presents an immediate problem. Thanks.
Thanks, Ajay. Tilak?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing that Ajay said, to distinguish between track 2 and back channel. Back channel is critical because the people who are involved in back channel are trusted aides of the prime ministers of the two sides, and they can solve a lot of issues, or at least talk about a lot of issues. Track 2 becomes important. You get to judge the other side, the non-official, but it will make sort of more impact if the track 2 results were then communicated to the governments. And this is what was discussed, this is what happened. As Ajay said, it was difficult to collate because many times the record of, there are so many track 2s going on. I know it may be 2 or 3, there could be even more. But are those discussions distilled and then fed to the governments? I'm not sure, or at least I don't know. So I think that's an important distinction to be made.
Thanks, Tilak. We have Chaudhary Saab who wants to ask a question. So Chaudhary Saab, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my question, and thank you for the session. I was struck by the fact that the diplomats on this call are looking at the relationship in cyclical terms, whereas perhaps the more academically inclined are willing to consider the possibility that given the trajectories of India's economic and military heft relative to Pakistan over the next few years, right now and the next few years, it may be possible for us to actually impose a peace indica on Pakistan on our terms. So my question really is that, given all the issues that Pakistan has right now, isn't this the best time, or are we possibly heading towards the best time in the next few years as the gap between India and Pakistan widens ever more in a sort of a compounding way, that we could get to that point where we can dictate the terms of our peace?
Thanks so much, Chaudhary Saab. Would anybody like to answer that question or react to it? Yeah, Tilak ji, go ahead.
Pakistan may be economically or politically weaker, as you put it in the chat box also. But, India will not be able to isolate itself from the spillover effects of what happens in Pakistan. I'll give you one example, the subject that's I've studied a lot, and interested in the issue of water. Today, situation is very different because there are floods. But if you look at water development and water structures in Pakistan, the worry in Pakistan by Pakistani think tanks themselves is that Pakistan is running out of water. And by 2025, according to the Pakistan Council of Research in Water Resources, the per capita availability of water will drop below 500 cubic meters annually, which means drought-like conditions in parts of the country. So what happens if there are water refugees from Sindh and South Punjab start marching towards India, to Rajasthan, to Gujarat? So you will not be able to escape. It may be a good thing to pat yourself and chest thump that Pakistan is going down the tube, but I don't think so India will be able to escape the repercussions of what happens in that case. So instead of imposing peace, as you mentioned, and to impose peace on them on our terms, I think we should be looking at our own vulnerabilities in terms of water, in terms of space, in terms of food availability equally, and see where we are.
Thank you. Thanks, Tilak. That's putting it very well. Thank you very much. May I now switch to the chat box? We have a question from Raghav Chandra. Raghav, as you know, is also from college and did history and other things. But basically, he's asking Tilak, what would be the best trigger for a sustainable and solid rapprochement between India and Pakistan? What would be the best trigger? Tilak ji or anybody else, Ajay or Raghavan, anybody can answer.
So I have answered that Pakistan would have to change its mindset and its DNA. So if you go down that list, it will require a step. So somebody says, Mandeep is asking, Tilak, how do we do this DNA surgery? You know, this is going to require a complete session in itself. That how do you change, first of all, what is Pakistan's mindset when it comes to India? You know, there's a lot to be said on that. And how do you change that mindset, if at all? So that, I don't think so, can be answered in a very short spell of time that we have today.
Okay, got it.
You know, there's another metaphor, Pittu, that is often used, and that is of normalcy. Our external affairs minister has used it, saying that we can have normal relations with Pakistan when it acts like a normal country. In fact, the normalcy metaphor has been used by Pakistan's army chief, General Bajwa, that we should become a normal country, you know, in a different context. So I think the issue here is that for India, for the last 2 or 3 decades, Pakistan is very much part of a counter-terrorism policy rather than a foreign policy because of the peculiar kind of challenges it presented in the shape of terrorism. And for India, that is a base minimum condition to reduce that level of terrorism, particularly since India's tolerance of terrorism has gone down, and then have a conversation. The current problem is that Pakistan itself doesn't have that space because of its politics, its fractious politics, and the Imran Khan factor of being able to have any kind of conversation with India, leave alone a constructive conversation that would lead to a peace dividend.
Thanks, Ajay. Raghavan ji, you wanted to say something?
Well, I have a slightly different view on DNA, because DNA is neither an explanatory factor nor a trigger. Because if you look around the DNAs in our neighborhood, it's not as if you have a great choice. And certainly at different points of time, in different countries, DNA has given you enormous difficulties, and it's not as if DNAs ever change. So you have to see sentiment in your neighborhood from that perspective, that no one in your neighborhood is ever going to have a DNA which you're going to be fully comfortable with or which you can fully trust. And this applies to relations with which you claim you have the closest of relations, or those with which you have the most adversarial relations. I think the issue is really of political and diplomatic processes. It's not as if anyone ever abandons reality when they decide on taking certain major political initiatives of the kind which Prime Minister Vajpayee took or Prime Minister Narendra Modi took in 2014 or 2015. It's not as if they were relying on suddenly there being a change of nature in Pakistan. No, the feeling was that you have certain pieces in place which will work for some time in your favor. So why not use that current situation to impart greater stability than there has hitherto been? So it's a calculated kind of calibration, and to some extent a risk which you are taking. I think to wait for somebody's DNA or nature to change, is somewhat unrealistic.
Okay, now here is a question that Raghav and Deepak Gupta further asked in continuation of this DNA or mindset change. They said, what is the trigger for it? What is going to be bankruptcy, insurgency, or war? What will be the trigger for this change in mindset that will happen? Sanjay, you're being very quiet.
I will come in. I see a series of questions from Rajiv, so I will come to those.
Okay, fine. Raghavanji,
I think,
bankruptcy, insurgency, or war?
I think on what will be the trigger, I mean, if history gives any answers, one trigger is that you don't become Prime Minister of India or Prime Minister of Pakistan to do small things. You want to do big things. And certainly in the last 20, 25 years, you have found people reaching out to do, trying to move mountains. And certainly that is always a trigger which we cannot anticipate, and which civil servants and diplomats and others will never advise, but people will do it. And I think that is always going to be the X factor in India-Pakistan relations.
So I have a different view, and I always have disagreed with Raghavan on this. You know, you can do political initiatives, Mr. Vajpayee's bus journey. You know, you can have different kinds of things, but they're not sustainable. They're simply not sustainable because whenever Pakistan finds an opportunity that it good relations with India, that's something that does not suit Pakistan's narrative that it has built up over the years. You look at the Pakistan army, I'll give you how the DNA and how the mindset is worked in Pakistan. I'm sure, I don't know about Raghavan and Ajay. When I was in Pakistan, I studied the Qaeda, what is taught in schools at the kindergarten level, you know, A for apple, B for ball. So there you have Zer se Zalim, and you have a photograph of a Sardar. So the mind of a child, from that age, all Sardars are Zalims. Zer se Daku, and you have a photograph of a fat Hindu with a bodhi. So the child thinks that all Hindus are Dakus. Now, this I have seen personally, it's not hearsay. So that is how the mindset, you know, unless you wash that kind of poison which is instilled in the school system, you start it today, it will change 15 or 18 years down the road. Till that time, generation after generation of people have been injected with this poison of the mindset of hating the Hindu, of hating India. So therefore, you can take very, very big moves. And people and leaders in the past have made big moves, but it is not sustainable. It will not sustain. So the question was that what can be a sustainable? So for that sustainable thing, I think a lot of deep background, deep research, and maybe a full session, as I said, that needs to be done.
So can I quickly make a comment to say that what you were saying is hearsay, as in the books and the, you know, what they paint as a Daku and all. So you don't want to say hearsay, but what you probably want to say is heresy. Anyway.
No. I meant that hearsay. I mean, I've seen it myself. I'm not depending on somebody else's version. I've seen it myself. I know you love to pun.
Mandy was only punning on it.
I know.
No, here's a question from Ajay Singha. He says, is Imran Khan coming back? Ajay, what do you want to say? Is Imran Khan coming back?
You know, I think Ajay needs to only hear the very interesting conversations going on in Pakistan right now. This is exactly the subject of a great debate. Imran Khan definitely believes he's coming back, because if he believes that there is a huge groundswell of support that he has a traditional constituency, and he hopes to be back in the next election. But the debate at this point of time is whether the army would let him. Given the kind of bitterness that has developed between the army and Imran, as indeed the army develops for all its proteges in the past, whether it was Nawaz Sharif or Bhutto or Benazir. But the point is that right now what is being talked about is a -1 formula, that the army wants a situation where it is anyone but Imran Khan. So I think it's up in the air. But at the moment, the army, which is the key institution that controls the politics, is not too keen on having Imran Khan back.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Ajay. Thanks for that insight. I have 3 questions from Rajiv Mehrishi, which says, what is the tax to GDP ratio in Pakistan? How come Pakistan has become a power deficit country from being a power surplus one? And number 3, if not trading with India, Pakistan is losing 2% GDP. What is it for India in GDP terms?
Okay.
Sanjay, would you like to answer?
So I think, yeah, the tax to GDP ratio is, as I mentioned, it's a big problem area, right? It's a part of the whole vested interest of the private sector coming in. So it's about pure taxes are only about 10% of GDP. You can add another 1% for other income of government. So roughly about 25% of government revenue is preempted by the army. So that's right. Second question on power. I think the power is, they have this very curious thing called, there is circular debt of the public sector, of the private, of the power sector, where basically one arm of the government charges another, it doesn't get paid. Eventually, it keeps sort of there's a bottomless pit, and every so often the IMF tries to resolve this problem. It's always thrown up as a major issue, the circular debt of the power sector. So what's the issue? Is no investment, very low pricing. The government doesn't have revenue, so they can't promote their own power plants. They don't have a really good framework for IPPs, for independent power producers. So all in all, it is a very miserable situation, despite the much hallowed investment of billions of dollars coming from the China-Pakistan economic corridor, where energy is a big focus. Despite that, they are facing very significant issues from the power sector, which is then shifts to the fisc, as you know very well, Rajiv, from your work in finance. Now, India's loss. So, if you do very quick back of the envelope calculations, you do 7% as the number I mentioned versus virtually nothing. Say India's exports of goods and services are in excess of, it's about $650 billion, right? You take 7% of that, it's almost $45 to $50 billion. Now that's not quite the same as GDP, as you know, but a certain fraction of that will add to GDP. But for me, India's losses from not engaging with Pakistan are much beyond these kinds of calculations, right? And they do eventually do impinge even on GDP, because there is the issue I meant of joint, working on climate change together. There was never a more, greater imperative for that. Creating dynamic regional value chain, this energy trade, India's own expenditure on defense, which gets jacked up because of the problems with Pakistan, and India's own global ambitions, right? Will it ever become a member of the Security Council or bigger groupings that it has ambitions for, if it cannot carry its own neighborhood with it, right? So, so I think there are these bigger issues, which certainly, so India, I agree with Ajay and what others have said, there's no way that India can ignore, and I don't think it's a two thing, it's a much bigger than a headache. It's a massive issue for India and its long-term sustainable growth. If you'll give, and then as I said earlier, the India-China example is staring us in the face, right? Why cannot you lead with trade? And let's push that. Both sides will have tremendous benefits from that, right? And we don't have to do big bang trade reforms. We can do similar small things to start and open up the windows. And incrementalism, those of us who work in South Asia, including know that incrementalism is the name of the game. You don't want to do anything big to upset and to create vested interests against that. But if we think that with China, who ostensibly is a much bigger issue for India than Pakistan, we can trade in excess of $100 billion with China. I dare say we can do several billions with Pakistan. My final word, if you'll permit, Pitu, is that I want to say a word on this track to diplomacy. When I was in the World Bank, and it still goes on, some of you may know, we actually did track 1.5 diplomacy. And it's been very successful. It has led to many initiatives. because you involve officials and former officials and other influences in a non-official setting. So you actually take back concrete ideas. And I can, spend a lot of time in giving examples of what this has done, even in an India-Pakistan context. But of course, it has done much more wonders for actual work on the India-Bangladesh, India-Nepal relationships. But it hasn't not had an effect on India-Pakistan as well.
Thanks, Sanjay. That's very, very useful. We are running short of time now. We're coming to the end of our discussion. So would Tilak, Raghavan or Ajay like to add something else before we finish? Thank you.
I'm not very optimistic at the moment about the way Indo-Pak relations are going. I think if we can manage our relationship, not let them deteriorate any further, and ensure that there is no terrorist incident, I think we would have done pretty well for ourselves. But since the relationship is always so fragile, one has to be very watchful and very careful of where the relationship sort of moves ahead.
Great. Thanks, Tilak. Ajay?
Sorry to interject. There's one more question that you might want to field from Arvind Wable between Ajay and Raghavan as they take their closing comments, please. Have a look at that.
What was the question? Please read it out, Mandy.
Okay, it says, what is the implications of the Pak-China relationship? Is Pak a proxy for China to keep India on the edge? So maybe in their closing comments, if they can bat for this last question, please.
Sure. Let me take that on. So firstly, on Pakistan-China relations, I think it's definitely a huge security risk and a very important issue from India's point of view, because apart from the gaming of the two-front war, now what you're talking of is a possible gaming of a continuous front war. So this is a strong relationship. We should have no illusions that an adversarial relationship with both Pakistan and China could lead to a future situation collusion between the two, and that becomes that doubles the threat for India. So we should be completely mindful of it, both in our military planning as well as in our diplomacy. On Pakistan, what I would say as final comment is that there is still a great deal of room for creative diplomacy, and that diplomacy must be given a chance. For instance, I would advocate that one of the first steps to be taken beyond the, you forget the peace dividend or the normalization of relations, in managing the relationship is having high commissioners in both places. Since I left, there have been no high commissioners in either capital. And that's what enables us to have those quiet conversations, to look at creative solutions, to talk to various actors. And I think that should be one of the proximate first steps that we take in normalizing this fragile relationship.
Thank you. Raghavan?
Just to add to what Ajay said, I think we have to be very mindful about China and Pakistan. But we have to be equally mindful that we don't go down the path of the self-fulfilling prophecy. That because we have bad relations with both Pakistan and China, they're out to get us. And we then imagine situations and conjure them into reality, so to say. Let's not forget that the ceasefire we spoke about, which was finalized last year between India and Pakistan, was at a time when India-China relations were going through a very bad patch, perhaps their worst patch in the last 50 years. So why should there be an India-Pakistan ceasefire on the LOC at a time when India-China relations are so bad is something which we should keep in mind. I think, as I said, it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of the self-fulfilling prophecy where relations with China or with Pakistan are concerned. And the only way you can avoid that trap is to make sure that your calculations are guided not by sentiment or by emotion, but by how you evaluate your national interest. I think we have to understand that India-Pakistan relations in both countries are determined to a very great extent by domestic politics in both those places. And that domestic politics can often act in unpredictable ways. So it's a complex situation, but as I said, we shouldn't forego opportunities for greater stability because we know that the odds are against something working out in the very long term. In the very long term, we'll all be dead. But in the short term, if we have a better situation, there's nothing wrong with that.
Thanks, Raghavan. Thanks, Tilakji, and thanks, Ajay Visaria, and thanks so much to our wonderful World Bank input that was shared with us on the economic front. Thank you so much for all of you for this fabulous discussion today. And may I, as usual, also thank I.L.A. Pasreach for making available Zoom and the YouTube links that is provided. We will share this on SKT and other places. Thank you to the principal of St. Stephen's College and the Alumni Association for posting this so that many of you could join. And thanks all for being here. Have a good evening and enjoy the single malt. Thank you. Bye.
All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.